This might be the most disturbing color in our history. Ground up, bottled, painted onto so many famous canvases, was once actual human flesh. The story begins at least over 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt, where the people had perfected mummification. The Greek historian Herodotus traveled through Egypt around 2,500 years ago and documented what he learned about this ancient mummification process. The goal of mummification was to preserve the body by dehydrating it and protecting it against pests, mainly insects. According to Herodotus, there were 3 different methods to mummify the body, ranging from the most perfect to the method used by the poorer classes. Here is a summary of what he described as the most perfect method. First, the brain was removed from the cranium. This was done by inserting a rod through the nose to liquefy the brain, and the matter was then drained out through the nose. The embalmers would then rinse the skull with certain drugs to clear any residual brain tissues and kill any bacteria. Next was the abdomen. It was opened and the internal organs were removed. And the body cavity was then rinsed with palm wine and rinsed again with an infusion of crushed fragrant herbs and spices. After the cleaning, the cavity was filled with spices including myrrh, cassia, and other spices and herbs. Then the cavity was finally sewn up. After that came the dehydration. The body was placed in nitron, a naturally occurring salt, for 70 days for it to be completely dehydrated but not too stiff. Finally, the body was washed again and wrapped in linen bandages and coated with a resin-like gum that sealed the layer, making it somehow waterproof as well as pest-proof. The finished mummy was placed into a human-shaped case, what we now call a sarcophagus. Centuries later, the mummy's story took an unexpected dark turn and continued somewhere far from Egypt. By around the 12th century, something called mummia began to show up in medieval Europe, and it was marketed as medicine. Originally, this mummia referred to a bitumen peach-like substance. Medieval European physicians and merchants first learned about it through trading with Middle Eastern countries. The Arabics and the Persians called this bitumen mummia with YA at the end of the word. They used it for wound care and fractures. However, as the word moved into medieval Latin and European languages, its spelling shifted into mummia without the Y. So increasingly, Europeans started to associate it with ancient Egyptian mummies because mummies often look dark, and so the medieval Europeans thought they were prepared with bitumen. Over time, mummia blurred further from dark resin scraped from mummy wrappings into powdered mummy material itself, the wrapping as well as the bones of the mummies. People believed that mummia could solve all kinds of problems, bruises, wounds, and other more serious illnesses such as internal bleeding. And European physicians prescribed mummia for all these sorts of problems. So naturally, demand grew and followed by the supply chain. Egyptian tombs were opened, mummies dragged out of their sarcophagus, ground up and traded all the way to Europe. By this point, you may ask, how many mummies were taken from Egypt to make this mummia? Well, the records across trading ports and middlemen were inconsistent, so we don't have a certain reliable number of how many mummies were actually taken. The mummia also didn't arrive as identifiable bodies. Buyers in Europe never saw a corpse most of the time. What they saw were jars, powders, and blocks that promised to heal all ailment and end all suffering. So it was hard to keep track of how many bodies were actually traded. However, we do know that this trade continued for hundreds of years, and then European demand helped push large-scale tomb openings and body extraction alongside other forms of looting in Egypt. And as the trade expanded, mummies became more and more scarce, and real mummies were harder and harder to come by. So what was the solution? Well, the merchants began to fake them. By the 16th century, multiple European observers wrote about fake mummia being manufactured from recent corpses, including bodies of executed criminals being sun-dried and sold into the apothecary supply chain. Some sources also describe dealers using bodies of the enslaved people and other vulnerable dead. In other words, anybody they could dig up without any consequence. So mummia kept being sold as medicine, but it went from a bitumen-like material to mummy scrapings, to ground up mummy bones, and now to the recently dead human flesh. So how did this mummia venture from the apothecary into the artist studios, right? We have to remember that back in the days, artists didn't buy neatly packaged tubes of paint like we do today. They were buying ingredients, dry powders, oil, and many of these materials came from the same places as medicine. The apothecary, from the 16th century onwards, and especially in the 19th and 18th century, more and more painters noticed this warm brown. They realized that when they mix it with oil, it created a brown oil paint that was quite perfect for shadows, underpaintings, glazes, as well as flesh tones. Because it was made from the substance sold as mummia, painters called it mummy brown. It was quite popular, particularly among pre-Raphaelite painters. Okay, so do we know for certain which masterpieces have actual human flesh in it? Well, to be honest, we actually don't know with 100% certainty, and for several good reasons. First, sampling is very restricted because it is physically very invasive, as you can imagine. To identify many pigments, conservators often use a tiny physical sample to run lab tests. Curators, understandably, are very reluctant to allow such sampling. And when they do, it's typically very minute, taken from little edges or existing damage. You can't just sample the middle of Rembrandt's face and run tests on it. You may ask, well, what about non-invasive tools? Well, the non-invasive tools we have so far are great for identifying elemental pigments like lead, mercury, but they are very ineffective in identifying organic matters. From what we learned so far, we know the evolution of mummia came from bitumen to actual dry mummies to more recently dead corpses. And the quality of this mummia is very inconsistent, which makes it even more difficult to come to a definitive conclusion. So now, what records and evidence do we have that prove that artists were actually buying mummy brown? Well, one of the biggest art suppliers in London was called Charles Robinson & Co. They were a major colorman supplying everyone from professional artists to hobbyists. According to National Geography, they listed mummy brown in their artist catalog from 1907 until 1933, which proved that it wasn't just a medieval rumor or a one-off prank. It was a normal item you could order as an artist well into the 20th century. And the Robinson business kept account ledgers that show a massive record of over 9,000 account holders from 1820 to 1939. The ledgers are still held in the Robinson archive at the University of Cambridge. In this archive, you can connect specific artists who bought mummy brown. And one name that came up frequently was Lawrence Elmer Tadema, a major Victorian painter. There's a famous story involving this artist and Edward Burne-Jones. According to accounts repeated in multiple sources, Edward Burne-Jones also used mummy brown as part of his standard palette, but he had no idea that it was made of actual mummies or human remains. Until one day in 1881, Lawrence Elmer Tadema came to visit Edward Burne-Jones and told him that he saw mummy at the colorman before it was made into pigment. Edward Jones' nephew recorded this incident and said that he was horrified. The artist went to his studio, took out his paint, and insisted that they bury it. And they did, conducting some kind of ritual for his tube of paint. Now the question is, did all the artists know that Mummy Brown was made of human remains? And if they did, how could they have the guts to use it? While we can't know for certain whether those artists knew, our best guess is twofold. First, most people didn't always know what they were buying. If we ask ourselves, right, do we always read the ingredient list of the things we buy? Probably most of the time the answer is no. And second, even when some of them probably did know, but it has become such an everyday commodity that they saw in the same supplies as resins, varnishes, and oils, it was normalized and people didn't raise an eyebrow about it. However, awareness finally started to change in the 1900s. We started to have more travel writings, more museum culture, and more public discussion of Egyptian antiquities, and less willingness to treat human remains as raw ingredients. And then there's the practical issue about the supply. Whether real mummy or fake, the supply was very limited, and it became harder to source and harder to justify the sourcing. So although it didn't vanish overnight, it started to taper off. By the mid-20th century, artists stopped asking for it, and suppliers stopped marketing it. And by the 1960s, we can say that it was completely gone from our stores. So if you see Mummy Brown for sale today, you can relax, knowing that it doesn't contain actual human remains. It is a modern synthetic mixture made to look like that old, warm, transparent brown. Now, different manufacturers mix different ingredients to create this color, and if you want to know for sure what's in it, you should check the pigment codes on the paint tube labels. For example, the most common blend is mixing PR101, a synthetic red iron oxide, PY42, a synthetic yellow iron oxide, and a black such as PBK7, lamp black. And you can use these colors to make your own version of Mummy Brown without tapping into the dark arts. However, when you visit an art museum next time and look up at those warm brown shades in the portraits, figures, or even still lifes and landscapes, you might actually be looking at human flesh. So if you enjoyed this story, subscribe and stay tuned for the next color story in the series.